1997, American retail was a religion. Shopping malls were cathedrals, store chains were gods, and consumers were the devoted congregation, showing up every weekend with wallets wide open. More than $30 billion would evaporate over the next 2 decades as one iconic brand after another decided the future wasn't worth paying attention to. This is how they did it. At the time, these were not failing businesses. Payless Shoe Source had over 4,000 locations globally, selling affordable footwear to families who just needed something that didn't cost a fortune. Radio Shack operated nearly 7,000 stores across the United States, putting a tech shop within 5 minutes of basically every American. Circuit City was moving $12 billion in electronics annually, and analysts genuinely believed it could outlast anyone. Pier 1 Imports was selling rattan furniture and scented candles to people who wanted their homes to feel expensive without paying for expensive. Bed Bath & Beyond had become synonymous with the American household setup, the place you went when you moved somewhere new and needed everything. And Kmart was once the largest retailer in the world. Let that sink in for a second. The plan, for most of them, was simple enough. Keep doing what worked and assume it would keep working forever. Executives believed that brand loyalty was basically a renewable resource. They believed foot traffic was a permanent feature of American life. They believed the future would look more or less like the past, just with slightly better signage. They were wrong about almost all of it. Payless Shoe Source decided in the early 2000s to lean hard into a strategy of aggressive discount promotions. Going out of business sales became a seasonal event. Dramatic red banners, urgent countdown messaging, the whole theatrical package. Customers would rush in, grab shoes at 50% off, and feel like they had won something. The only problem was that the company was using these promotions to generate short-term cash while quietly accumulating debt it had no real plan to repay. By 2017, that debt had climbed past $840 million, and the executives who had been staging fake emergencies for years were about to experience a real one. We need to create urgency, the thinking went inside corporate. Move inventory, generate traffic. It made a certain kind of sense, the way all bad ideas make sense when you're staring at a spreadsheet that only shows you the next quarter. Radio Shack had a different problem entirely. The company's leadership in the mid-2000s looked at the rise of e-commerce and essentially said, "That's interesting, but our customers come in for the cables." They weren't entirely wrong about the cables. Radio Shack did sell an enormous volume of proprietary connectors, adapters, and components that people sometimes genuinely needed. But Amazon was already building the infrastructure to sell those same parts cheaper, faster, and without requiring anyone to drive to a strip mall. Radio Shack kept remodeling its stores, kept hiring staff to explain products that consumers increasingly looked up on their phones, and kept missing the larger point with impressive consistency. Circuit City, meanwhile, was running a masterclass in how to dismantle your own competitive advantage. In 2007, the company fired approximately 3,400 of its most experienced sales staff, specifically because those employees had been there long enough to earn higher wages. The idea was to cut costs. The outcome was to eliminate the one thing that made Circuit City worth visiting: people who actually understood what they were selling. It is a bit like a hospital firing its senior surgeons to save on salaries and replacing them with people who have technically read about surgery. At first, nothing seemed catastrophically wrong. Sales dipped, but dips happen. Analysts flagged concerns, but analysts always flag concerns. Pier 1 Imports was still posting modest profits in 2016. Bed Bath & Beyond was still handing out those famous 20% off coupons like a national pastime. Kmart was still technically open in hundreds of locations. Then the 2010s arrived with something that looked less like competition and more like a controlled demolition. By 2008, Circuit City had already entered its final chapter. The company filed for bankruptcy in November of that year and liquidated every last store by the following spring. More than 30,000 employees lost their jobs in a matter of months. Best Buy, which had invested heavily in staff training programs and built out a genuine service infrastructure through its Geek Squad operation, absorbed most of the market share almost immediately. It was like watching someone hand a winning lottery ticket to the one competitor who had been doing everything right, while everyone else tore their tickets up for kindling. Radio Shack filed for bankruptcy for the first time in 2015, having failed to execute any meaningful pivot to e-commerce or mobile accessories, despite several attempts and one baffling Super Bowl ad that cost more to produce than most of its stores earned that year. It emerged from bankruptcy, filed again in 2017, and eventually shrank to a near-ceremonial existence of fewer than 500 locations, down from nearly 7,000 at its peak. Meanwhile, Amazon had quietly become the destination for every cable, adapter, and battery that Radio Shack had once dominated. Turns out, selling components online is not especially difficult once you've built a global logistics empire. Radio Shack just never got around to building one. Pier 1 Imports entered the 2000 2000s, still operating like a catalog retailer from 1992. The website was clunky, the inventory often didn't match what was physically in stores, and the brand kept assuming that the right seasonal display would bring shoppers back from wherever they'd gone. It's a little bit like a video store in 2010, deciding the solution to empty shelves was a nicer poster for the new releases section. By early 2020, Pier 1 had filed for bankruptcy protection and announced plans to close all 936 of its remaining stores, a number that had itself already been dramatically reduced from its earlier peak of over 1,000 locations. Bed Bath & Beyond is the one that will genuinely baffle business school students for decades. Between 2004 and 2021, the company spent approximately $11.8 billion buying back its own stock, money that could have funded store renovations, supply chain upgrades, or a competitive online platform. Instead, executives made the stock price look healthy in the short term, while the actual business quietly deteriorated underneath. Think of it like fixing your credit score by selling your furniture. The number looks better, but you have nowhere to sit. Behind the scenes, the coupon strategy that had made the brand famous was becoming a financial liability. Those 20% off mailers were so deeply embedded in consumer behavior that shoppers simply waited for them before buying anything, which compressed the company's already thin margins even further. Every coupon that went out was essentially an admission that the regular prices weren't competitive. And in a world where Amazon could undercut those prices without any coupon at all, the math was never going to work. Payless Shoe Source filed for bankruptcy in April 2017, closed roughly 400 stores, attempted a restructuring, and then filed for bankruptcy again in February 2019. This time, it was final. Nearly 2,100 stores closed. The brand that had spent years staging fake going-out-of-business sales eventually held a real one, and almost nobody could tell the difference. A retail industry analyst described it at the time as the boy who cried liquidation, which is either the saddest or the funniest thing ever written about footwear, depending on your mood. Kmart's collapse was slower and, in some ways, stranger. After merging with Sears in 2005 in a deal that was briefly described as a retail masterstroke, the combined company spent years failing to meaningfully modernize either chain. The logic behind the merger was that two struggling retailers could somehow combine their weaknesses into a strength, which is a theory that has never once worked in the history of business, but keeps getting tried anyway. Walmart had already rebuilt its supply chain and pricing model to a level Kmart could not realistically approach, and Target had captured the middle market consumer who wanted a slightly more pleasant shopping environment without the warehouse aesthetic. Kmart responded by becoming neither existing in a kind of retail purgatory where nothing was particularly cheap, nothing was particularly pleasant, and the stores genuinely felt like a time capsule from 1994. The loyalty program wasn't compelling. The private label products weren't distinctive. The locations were often in areas that foot traffic had quietly abandoned. By 2023, only a handful of Kmart locations remained open anywhere in the United States, each one functioning more as a regional curiosity than a viable retail operation. Bed Bath & Beyond filed for bankruptcy in April 2023 and began closing all of its remaining 360 stores. It was the kind of ending that felt both inevitable and avoidable. A company that had once been a household name, reduced to a brand acquired for parts and relaunched as an online-only operation that most people treat as a mild curiosity. The coupon empire fell, and we are not talking about a modest coupon operation. Those mailers had been a fixture of American junk drawers for 30 years. 6 brands, thousands of locations, tens of thousands of jobs, more than $30 billion in collective losses, write-downs, and wasted capital. And at the center of almost every story, the same essential failure: the belief that what worked yesterday would keep working tomorrow without any particular effort to earn it. If Bed Bath & Beyond had used even a portion of those $11.8 billion to build a functional e-commerce platform and renegotiate its supplier relationships, it might still be sending you coupons right now. If Radio Shack had leaned into its genuine technical expertise and built an online parts marketplace before Amazon arrived, it could have owned a niche that still exists and still needs serving. If Circuit City had kept its experienced staff instead of firing them to save on wages, it might have outsurvived Best Buy entirely, and people would probably be debating which chain was better the same way they debate streaming services today. But they didn't do any of that, and as it turns out, retail is considerably less forgiving than a going out of business sale that never quite ends. Eventually, the banners come down for real.